Pijajiko Pijajiko ma Nishnabe Kio Mama Weniniwa. I greet each and every one of you beautiful people, relatives, friends, to this beautiful homeland where I am at this moment, and the homeland of my people, the Algonquin people. Bienvenue à tous, bienvenue ici à la territoire non cédé de la nation Algonquin. I'm always honored and proud to bring greetings and to welcome brothers and sisters and friends into the homeland of our people. I greet you with a good heart. I greet you and acknowledging your ancestors of Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast. And I also acknowledge all people's ancestors. We must never forget our ancestors, never. But as Anishinaabe people, we understand our ancestors. We understand the Creator in the way that the Creator blessed us with through those teachings, through those ceremonies, and through the prayer. It is said in our way of knowing and being when we gather together and when we welcome you into our home. We welcome you with kindness, and we also must give you a blessing. That first blessing is that welcome. You're welcome into our homeland. So you're welcome into our home. So so happy that you are here, and I welcome you. We give a prayer. Let's give a prayer to one another. Let's give that thanks to the Creator for bringing us here together. Let's ask the Creator to continue to bless the work that each and every one of you are doing relating to homes, relating to that security and safety that the people need. And that is to have a place to call home. And the work that you are doing is so important, so important. It's called housing. But we know what this means. We know it means a place where we can have that shelter, and a place that we can have that security, and a place that we can call home. And we know many out there don't have that, but let's lift our hearts and our voice in prayer and ask for that guidance and to give that strength and that wisdom and knowledge to continue doing the good work, and to thank the Creator for bringing us here together to share that knowledge and to gain that knowledge. And we're going to do this together with one mind, one voice, one heart, one spirit, and we say Chimigwej, Gishiminado, Migwej, Gina, Kego, Chimigwej. And Abigis Kokomisug and Abigis Mishom Sug Daspinigan. Nibuksendam Mashkawis Iwinunji, the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. Nibuksendam Gishiminado, Nimbakawin, Nibuksendam Gishiminado, Widokowado, Winunji Kakina, Nongum, Shishwabang. Gishiminado, Chimigwejonji, Nishnabe Gatsukawin, Migwajni Genwendagana, Chimigwej, Migwej Kokomisug, Mishom Sug, Migwej. We come together, Creator, as brothers and sisters in the circle, and we ask that the grandmothers and the grandfathers guide this meeting, bless this meeting, protect this meeting, and we ask you, Creator, to loan us your wisdom, your knowledge, and good words to be spoken here today. We thank you, Creator, for the love that you have, as we thank you for all of your blessings in creation. We acknowledge our ancestors who are in the spirit world and our relatives, and Creator, with our heart and our prayer, we ask, Creator, for that strength to do the good work for our communities, for the people we serve, and let us always remember in our prayers all those who do need that prayer. And Creator, we thank you for your love, and we love you, Creator. Miigwech. Thank you, Miigwech.
Thank you, Claudette. It's beautiful. Love the prayer. Thank you for being here. Chimigwech. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take 1 to maybe 3 questions after our presentations from the audience chat. So I'll ask that each of you, if you have a question, to please leave your question in the chat. And any other remaining questions, we can get back to you later on with those questions. Please help me welcome our first presenters, Nazin Nasrallah, Meghna Bhamachari, and Ellie Shavri from the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. Nazir is an applied sociologist and alumni of Ottawa and Carleton Universities. He is a senior policy research professional, offering a distinguished, long-standing career leveraging extensive subject matter expertise in socioeconomic policy research, methodology and statistics with special interest in diversity and Indigenous studies. Naza is currently the Director of Research at the Congress of Aboriginal People since 2019. Ellie holds a Bachelor of Social Sciences in Sociology and Women's Studies from the University of Ottawa and is currently a bilingual research analyst at the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. Ellie is passionate about gender diversity, inclusion, and equity, and advocates for off-reserve Indigenous peoples across Canada. Previously, as a project coordinator for gender equality at CAP, she focused on rights of disabled QT BIPOC women and consistently amplifies the challenges faced by vulnerable communities in Canada. Magna is a senior economist at Big River Analytics, which is a Métis-owned consulting firm with staff across Canada. Magna has experience conducting research on various topics in public policy and applied economics. She has experience and a lot of interest in housing-related issues. Magna's prior work includes consulting for the U.S. federal government and conducting research at the International Water Management Institute in Gurjat, India. Magna has a PhD in economics from the Pennsylvania State University and a master's and bachelor's in economics from the University of Delhi. It's amazing. I'll turn it over to you guys. You can share your screen with us.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Elder Commander, for the beautiful prayers. Thanks for starting us in a good way. Always, Chimigwich for that. Thanks, Tiara, for the intros. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to present to you today the topic of closing the housing gap costing study by the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. I'd like to start off by making some both land and authorship acknowledgements. So the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, CAP, is located, respectfully acknowledges the location of its national office in the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, Algonquin peoples and the descendants. Also acknowledges the other, all other unceded traditional territories of CAP's affiliated PTOs, constituents residing in urban, rural, northern communities from coast to coast to coast. CAP is one of the 5 national indigenous organizations established in 1971, hence the logo, 52 years. And then represents the interest of First Nations, status, non-status, Métis, Southern Inuit peoples from residing off reserve. Big River Analytics, our research partner, BRA, is a Métis-owned consulting firm for its staff across Canada. Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers who work on this project are located on the Coast Salish territories in the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island region of BC, territories of people of the Treaty 7 region and Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3 in Calgary, Alberta, and the territories of Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lune Payawak, and the Attawandaron First Nations in London, Ontario. This work was co-developed by CAP and BRA. CAP received funding from CMHC and the National Housing Strategy and CERNAC. So moving along, agenda. It's next slide, thank you. So this is the agenda, a little bit ambitious. We're gonna do our best today. I'll be doing mostly the context, and both Ellie and Megan will take a deeper dive into key findings right after. Next slide, please. So this project really started a few years ago. This is a multi-phase research program that started with phase 1. That was a comprehensive literature review that looked at the connection between housing outcomes and housing and socioeconomic outcomes, namely education, labor market, health, and language. Then phase 2 it was the actual data analysis phase where we actually confirm those correlations and we quantify them. We use both descriptive and multivariate analysis. I actually had the pleasure of presenting in person some of the findings of phase 2 back in at your CHRA's conference back in April in Winnipeg in person. Phase 3 is of course, the one at hand right now. So after we identified all those gaps, now we're looking at costing study, which will tell us a little more how much it's going to cost the government to close those studies. Next slide, please. So there are two main research questions guiding this work. So first one is about what are these gaps in the core housing needs and how much it's going to cost to close them. Next slide, please. So some key terms that would help us really navigate through all this research. Core housing. So core housing is really a composite score, if you like. It's made up of three main metrics. So namely affordability, adequacy, otherwise known as repairs, suitability, otherwise sometimes known as crowdness. So for a household to be in a core housing, it needs to have at least one or more of these standards applies to it, and they need to the household also needs to spend more than 30% of their income to access local housing that meets all those standards. I think it's really important to note that housing suitability standards are currently defined based on historical Western perspectives of what housing households should look like. Indigenous populations may, as you can imagine, have different preferences regarding family, household, and structures. So I'd like to also remind everybody that the current definition of affordability, adequacy, and suitability are not enough to address the needs of indigenous populations in housing. Housing standards definitions should encompass cultural traditions, access to land, gathering spaces, and choice of indigenous populations to have autonomy over where they are situated, environmental access and choice in traditional medicine, and access to cultural gathering spaces. Next, please. Research, one slide, okay. So continuing on the key terms, the off-reserve. So this is focusing on off-reserve, which is basically any population living outside of a reserve, otherwise known as reserve CSD or census subdivision as defined by Stats Canada. Next, please. So the data that was used to inform this research came from a few sources. Census 21 data, which informed mainly the quantitative part work of this research, but also equally important CAPS Housing Needs Survey, which is proudly was completed, surveyed and collected recently. It's the most recent data, just a few months ago, that informed the quantitative side, specifically looking at the specific repairs, detailed repair that was not otherwise captured by census data, but also was informed qualitative data section of the housing experience of this research. We use other data from CMHC, such as RS means databases, BC Housing, and academic literature. Next slide. So all this data basically inform the main analyses informed by this data have to do with the needs gaps analysis, costing of closing the gap, and the qualitative analysis, which will all be outlined in more details. So speaking of which, I would like to talk a little bit more about the key findings. So we have the quantitative side and the qualitative side. So I'm gonna like to pass on now it's over to you, Meghna, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazi. So on the quantitative side, we first look at the national level, a higher percentage of Indigenous households living off reserve are in core housing need compared to non-Indigenous households. Core housing need is experienced by about 14% of First Nations households, 11% of Métis, and 24% of Inuit households. There are also differences in the core housing need rate between status and non-status First Nations and Inuit households living inside Inuit Nunangat and versus outside Inuit Nunangat. When looking at households only in core housing need, we find that a majority of First Nations and Métis households are living in unaffordable housing, whereas suitability issues seem to be the main sort of challenge facing Inuit households. Next slide, thanks. And this map sort of presents the gap in core housing need rates between Indigenous and non-Indigenous households across provinces and territories. A darker color indicates sort of a greater gap in the core housing need. The core housing need gaps are largest in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories. In the next slide, we'll also look at the top housing need by province and territory. So across almost all of the regions, the majority of off-reserve Indigenous households in core housing need are living in unaffordable housing. In the Northwest Territories, the majority of off-reserve Indigenous households in core housing need are living in inadequate housing, whereas in Nunavut, the main challenge is suitability issues again. We then look at how core house in the next slide. We then look at how core housing need rates vary with whether households are owners or renters. So approximately 57% of Indigenous households are homeowners, whereas the similar number is 67% for non-Indigenous households. Among Indigenous households living off reserve, there are the core housing need rates between owner and renter households are drastically different. And consistent with that, gaps in core housing need rates between Indigenous and non-Indigenous households are much smaller for owner households compared to renter households. So these, slicing the data in these ways helps us sort of understand what are the populations and what are the characteristics of populations and how housing need varies across these populations. So in the next slide, we sort of describe the key findings of our costing analysis. So as a first step in the costing analysis, we estimate the per intervention cost to address each type of housing standard or housing need. So the first is on affordability, and unaffordable housing conditions we consider can be addressed through cash transfer that offsets excess housing costs for 1 year. And our estimate suggests that the average cost is approximately $3,000 per intervention per year. Inadequate housing conditions can be addressed through providing a cash transfer that covers the cost of conducting major repairs in the dwelling. We estimate the cost using detailed repair needs data that we collected for Indigenous households living off reserve from the CAP housing survey. And this was estimated at about $8,300. Finally, housing suitability, we assume that unsuitable housing conditions can be addressed by the construction of a townhouse with the number of bedrooms required for the household. The average cost of new residential construction in Canada, we estimate at approximately $192,000. Now, it's very important to note for this one is that the estimates presented don't include things like the cost of site preparation or the cost of servicing a new lot or even the cost of land due to data limitations. And finally, in the next slide, we use the estimated cost of addressing each of these affordability, adequacy, and suitability needs to calculate the total cost of closing the core housing need gap between non-Indigenous households and off-reserve Indigenous households. And the total cost comprises a one-time component of approximately $1.32 billion for addressing using suitability and adequacy interventions, and an annual component of $58 million for affordability interventions. Note that the estimates here are only sort of the estimates for cost of closing the current core housing need gap. These are not the cost of eliminating or even reducing by half the core housing need faced by Indigenous households living off reserve. Finally, I'll pass it on to Ellie to talk a bit about the qualitative results that we have from the study.
Good afternoon. So on the qualitative side, we will discuss on community perspectives on current housing gaps. So as previously mentioned, our team analyzed over 1,300 responses from the community to listen and learn more about their housing experiences beyond what the quantitative data was able to share. Our hopes were to learn and collect and analyze data meaningfully on Indigenous identity and unique housing experiences, but also to capture the mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual health impacts associated with home repairs, accessibility, and suitability. So moving to the next slide, we will focus on 4 areas. First, we'll discuss on safety and well-being. We've seen that intersection of unique identities such as gender, Indigenous identity, and sexual orientation uniquely impact housing experiences. This is especially true for women and individuals within the 2S LGBTQIA+ community express the continuous fear of discrimination from landlords leaving them in unstable housing conditions. Not being able to afford bills, repairs, and features to make home accessible or culturally grounded heavily impacts the well-being and safety of those individuals and their family. Therefore, securing and maintaining housing continues to be difficult due to continuous cycles of discrimination and racism, both structurally and on the individual levels. Under the theme of health, we've seen that the health impacts of their housing conditions. Many responses indicated living in poor dwelling conditions with mold, poor ventilation, bug infestations, and inadequate insulation directly impacted the physical and mental health and emotional and spiritual health of families, especially children and individuals with chronic illnesses. So Indigenous family with members that have disabilities struggle to find accessible housing. Therefore, housing support programs should also consider the needs of individuals who are unable to maintain their dwelling. So under the theme of home and cultural connection, respondents share that home represents safe spaces that are affordable, free from violence, and accessible to those with evident and non-evident disabilities. Many of the responses highlighted the community resilience with being faced with homelessness and spoke about the mental, emotional, and physical health that impacts of couch surfing, lacking permanency, and being dependent on family members. Respondents also highlighted a need to access community gathering and traditional ways of being and knowing. Some families hope for their children to meet and play with other Indigenous children. So housing standards should incorporate broader themes of safety, cultural inclusion, accessibility, and availability of mental health services, with many indicating current precarious housing conditions, unsafe living conditions, or homelessness. Making changes to the current housing systems needs to be an urgent priority. So on the next slide, in the spirit of human rights space, we've seen that accountability is crucial to ensuring that governments and organizations are held responsible for their role in upholding Indigenous housing rights. Housing solutions must incorporate and honor Indigenous knowledge and tradition in all housing solutions and implement community engagement within all decision-making processes. So in the final slides, so there is ways that can be improved quantitatively and qualitatively. So Statistics Canada collects information on whether a dwelling is in need of major repairs, but doesn't collect detailed information on the types of repairs needed. So due to limited data availability, cost estimates for interventions involving new residential construction do not include the cost of site preparation of the cost of land. And Western research continues to influence research in various ways. Overall, we've tried to disseminate all findings in a good way that was strength-based and honors experiences and stories shared with us. So data gaps related to major repairs addressed by the CAP Housing Survey, which collected data on the number and types of repairs households needed. And finally, Each researcher approached this data in a good way that is relational, well-intended, open-minded, and attempts to avoid and always acknowledge any underlying assumptions, biases that may exist. Thank you. I will pass it to Nazim now. Nazi.
Just sorry about that. Just very quickly, I was saying that I don't think I'm looking at the time. There are some suggestions for moving forward. This is based directly on the findings from the study. But I just want to say that based on that cap, we'll continue to advocate and emphasize not just for more funding, as you noticed, whatever funding we got, we're really looking at the core housing gap, but there are much more monies required. But also more importantly, or equal important, is permanent funding models, right? Also, CAP should advocate and emphasize Indigenous rights to housing and self-determination. So in conclusion, really, and based on that, closing the housing gap for Indigenous peoples goes beyond financial investments, in repairs and construction. It's really about respecting Indigenous self-determination, sovereignty, and housing initiatives rooted in culture and community. So while repairs are important, it's crucial to recognize that not everyone has a permanent home. So many faces homelessness, impacting their emotional, mental, and physical health. So this the end of the next slide, please. So this is the end of the presentation. Chimigwich, happy to take any questions.
Okay, if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand or write it in the chat for us, please. Okay. And Chloe, if you spot one before me, maybe you could let them ask the question.
I think I see Jillian Amy's here. Apologies if I've mispronounced your last name, but I'm going to unmute you and feel free to ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for the presentation and the research. It's really intriguing. I was wondering, outside of normal homeownership, renter models of tenure, were you looking at exploring other options? Specifically, I'm talking about community housing models.
I can probably start. The reason that we actually had this qualitative component, so we're very proud to be conducting the survey, the CAP survey, because it did have the opportunity to survey over 1,300 people. So that gave us really more detailed information about what the needs are that goes beyond the physical repairs. Okay, so that it's all really speaking to goes way more of that. It goes to the core of the Indigenous perspectives and experiences that relates to health, environment, etc., etc. So that was really what we were able to. That's what really came out of the in-depth responses that we got. But I think we are still looking honestly at the data. The data is so rich. We're still looking into possibilities that came out of the qualitative part. Now, I don't know if there's any thing you would like to add, Ellie or Meghna, because I know we focused when it comes to the quantitative part, which was informed by the survey, but also census, we really focused on the core needs, closing the gap of the core needs, right? So, and we are, and so, yeah, that was the focus for this research at least, but it's really a good point. That's something we can perhaps keep in mind for future research.
Okay, I can take another question from the chat. This one is from Viola Thomas. Are you using UNDRIP as part of your rights-based approach? and how much of the funding is tied to colonial models of housing. I know housing on reserve imitates colonial models of both financing and construction, which quite often housing providers will use cheaper material to save costs.
Definitely, this is some of the I guess limitations of the work. This is how we try to shed some light on how we can improve this. We were only looking at a specific, I guess, a specific side of the research, which was informed by available data. It happened to be the census data and other government data, but we tried to actually go beyond that to capture, the much wholesome perspectives that is driven by indigenous worldviews and experiences. So we definitely acknowledge the limitations, and we definitely acknowledge the limitations of the particular key terms that we went through them being Western based terms. So the qualitative data, however, that we were able to obtain from the survey that was conducted by CAP really helped us to have a better understanding about the housing need that goes beyond the physical repairs, like we discussed. Okay, and we will continue to look at this data. In fact, our next project is to take even a deeper dive at this qualitative data in particular, and that will hopefully will lead to more more conclusive and more fulsome research.
Okay, I will take one more question, and we have one from Peter Martin. So you have the floor.
Everyone. I really appreciate this answer. One question I was going to ask, though, is to do with the survey itself and the breakdown of the replies. Can you break down the 1,300 responses into First Nations communities, rural respondents, and urban respondents? Because I feel there's quite a different range of potential opportunities for change based on which of those three places First Nations Indigenous people are living.
That's an excellent question. We always attempt to disaggregate data, the various Indigenous identities, but also other looking at other cross-sectionalities. Everything we've done on the quantitative side, we looked at Indigenous, non-Indigenous, but also tried to look, as you noticed, within the Indigenous community as well. And for the qualitative data, the initial work that we've done was grouping the responses from into those themes. But I think the next, I guess, phase or next stage of this qualitative research is to try and disaggregate within these qualitative, because we do understand that this will produce important perspectives and insights that will further guide the research. So, thank you. Thank you for that question.
Okay, thank you, group from CAP. It was a very good presentation. And we'll be moving along to our next presenter. So up next, we have Jonathan Potskin and Gail Mushirahamwe. If I'm pronouncing that right, my apologies. And they are from the National Association of Friendship Centers. Please welcome Jonathan and Gail.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just quickly going to share my screen. All right. So good afternoon. My name is Gail Mushirahamwe, and I am the research coordinator at the NAFC. I've been working at the NAFC for the last 4 years and worked very closely with Jonathan. I will be presenting from Ottawa, where our national offices are currently located. The NAFC acknowledges with respect the Algonquin peoples on whose traditional and unceded territory the NAFC head office is located, and who allow us to work, learn, and live on their land. There you go, Jonathan.
Thank you, Kyle. My name is Jonathan Potskin. I'm Cree and Métis from Alberta in Treaty 8. And I have been at the Friendships NAFC for about 6 months now as the manager for policy and research. And yeah, I look forward to presenting some of this information that we're working on right now. Thank you.
So that is our team currently working on our housing project. It's comprised of myself, Jonathan, and our research coordinator, Justin. Back in 2021, during the National Association of Friendship Centers annual general meeting, AGM, our research and data department had an engagement booth where we distributed surveys on improving our methods of engagement and identifying relevant topics and themes to partner on. So in our survey, we had the following topics outlined, such as justice, housing and homelessness, child welfare, environmental issues and concerns, and so forth. And although we all acknowledge that these topics are all intertwined, housing and homelessness was identified as the strongest topic of interest, with about a 90% interest rate out of the 50 plus submitted surveys. So with this survey, we also discovered that friendship centers were interested in working closely with the research and policy department here at the NAFC, as well as sharing more proactive approaches when it comes to engagements for future projects, research projects, and engagements. And so we started working on this project. So the NAFC aims to develop a Friendship Center specific national action plan and framework regarding housing and homelessness through our partnership with CMHC. So our national action plan will work towards building capacity to address community needs and assist with the foundation of building a national housing and homelessness database. The project will identify existing urban Indigenous housing and homelessness programs and initiatives throughout the Friendship Center movement, specifically working with Friendship Centers that are aligned with the NAFC, but also seeking to potentially engage with other Friendship Centers and urban Indigenous organizations. The resources from this project will be applied at the national, provincial, and local levels to leverage future programming and policy funding and development. The research project will also serve as an information database by putting together all of the pre-existing work that Friendship Centers do around the topics of housing and homelessness. And these will be housed on various NAFC platforms, such as the New Journeys website. And Friendship Centers can use this database as a reference to addressing gaps within housing and homelessness programming at the local level. But this can also be shared with future members and urban Indigenous community members that are seeking to learn more about housing and homelessness initiatives being held within their local Friendship Centers. So for this project, the main goal and research objective of these efforts is to increase capacity in the homelessness service delivery sector, while also working to have a research component included to this project. And this can be seen through efforts surrounding our engagement, the record keeping of the process of creating this national action plan and framework, the partnerships that we develop, and also seeking opportunities to publish all of our materials within the future. So each of these activities have and will continue to concentrate on finding existing knowledge, data, and program gaps, engaging with communities, and translating information in a way that is accessible and inclusive to all parties involved, future and ongoing. And our Indigenous-led and community-driven approach will ensure that the needs of the communities we serve are met and that the programs and services are delivered using Indigenous perspectives, teachings, and experiences. So our approaches will work to ensure that urban Indigenous communities are supported with dignity and respect. The NAFC will continue to be working to ensure that an intersectional lens and Indigenous worldview is incorporated throughout the creation of the National Action Plan and framework. And by approaching it this way, it will outline how an intersectional lens is applied to understanding homelessness and housing, precarious housing in urban Indigenous context, as well as being able to better identify gaps and obstacles that fall within the realm of gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and residency. And this will also help to ensure that we have a more well-rounded understanding of how homelessness is experienced, as well as an opportunity to engage with our partners that may not necessarily be working directly with communities that are dealing with homelessness or precarious housing. So this is our project timeline. So we started off this project with a literature review, and this took place between June to September, where we were engaging closely with our policy team to review externally relevant research housing materials and literature on housing and homelessness, so that this can kind of help with building or creating a bit of a direction with where we were going with our internal environmental scan. So the environmental scan, like previously mentioned, took place internally within the NAFC. So the research department led this, but with the hopes of also branching out to our other departments, programs, and our data team to kind of help verify our list and also contribute based on their own initiatives that require collecting this kind of information. And then we proceeded to go into the engagement phase, which is currently taking place right now. This is one of the key elements of this project, as housing has been identified as a huge topic of relevance within the Friendship Center movement. We've also worked on building our networks and internal/external partnerships. So alongside our work with CMHC, we also created a partnership with the Ontario Federal Housing Advocate. That's something that we'll also be discussing more in depth as the presentation continues. So with this partnership, we're working on engagements on the topic of encampment communities with friendship centers. So these engagements will be happening simultaneously with the CMHC engagements over the next few months up until November, December. And for these engagements, the main goal is looking into answers or even discourse surrounding the questions on the experiences and obstacles that may be encountered when attempting to run a housing or homelessness program. So this is an opportunity to learn more from the perspectives of frontline workers, folks that are working day to day with these different homelessness encampment communities and their experiences with upholding these programs. We also have a series of internal engagements also set up. So talking to our provincial and territorial association technicians to kind of help gauge more information on programs that are being held within their provinces and territories. And then we're also having worked on a proposal to present this project at president and executive meetings, and then also holding another engagement, a larger engagement at our upcoming summit, Urban Indigenous NAFC Summit. That's going to be taking place later on this year. And then lastly, we'll be working on reporting. So this will take place between December and February. We'll be working on reporting for CMHC, but also kind of expanding this work on resources that can be shared again on all of our platforms, as well as the contributions towards the actual National Action Plan and framework. And then we'll also ensure to incorporate knowledge dissemination sessions, so opportunities to engage and check in with our members to ensure that the work that we've produced is still relevant and aligns with friendship centers and just the friendship center movement in general. Which then leads us to talk more about our external partnerships, which will be led by Jonathan.
Thank you for all that, Gail. You did a great job. So I came into the job in late May this year, and we were meeting with the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate at the time. and they were looking to partner with us on some of the research that they are doing right now. So through the past research we looked at they've had Indigenous sections, but the Indigenous sections didn't come from an Indigenous worldview and didn't fully show the experience of the urban Indigenous experience within homelessness and housing across the country. And at this time, they are working on their review on the encampments across the country, which is really huge. And a lot of friendship centers are supporting encampment communities. So we thought it was a great opportunity for us to join in with the OFHA office and work with them on their Indigenous sections of bringing forward an Indigenous voice and Indigenous experience to the review that they are doing right now on the encampments across the country. So we put forward, we put forward 4 friendship centers to do this review with them. And we wanted the main goal that they were looking at was the systemic barriers that are faced by people that are in the encampments. And what they did originally was they had everybody submit phone videos to them. So we thought that wasn't fair to Indigenous people, for people in encampments in general, because a lot of them don't have phones, and if they do, they don't have them for very long. So that initiative we thought was not going to bring forward a true voice for the Indigenous experience. So we decided to do a qualitative study to look at these 4 friendship centers. So we chose 4 friendship centers that they were studying themselves. And in the end, we went with 2 of the friendship centers. So we have a friendship center in Prince George and Winnipeg that we're going to be doing engagements with. The engagements are a part of the CMHC project, but we also attached at the end of these engagements questions specific to the work that they're doing with the encampment communities. And what they see are the systemic barriers that are faced not only by the people in encampments, but also by the service providers that are helping people in encampments. So we wanted to get a holistic view, not only just from the people from the encampments, but also the people at the friendship center level and the urban Indigenous level, because we also invited the friendship centers to invite their partners to come to the engagements as well. So it's not just going to be a friendship center voice, it'll be an urban Indigenous voice of how the community is coming together to assist this community. And also looking at the systemic barriers that they face, so we can look at ways to put them into different forms of housing. And we want to look at safe housing for them as well. So one of the big questions that we ask is, what is safe housing to them? And what is a safe community to them? And I think that's where we need to start, is where do they want to be? Because a lot of the times in the cycle of homelessness, we just put them into SROs or into short-term band-aid solutions. So we want to know, like, what is safe housing to them? And maybe the encampments are safe housing, and we have to look at a way to maybe work within that system. So we don't want to come in with any judgments. We want to work with the community and see what barriers are there and how we can assist them in working through these barriers, and also to take these barriers away from the communities that are in the encampments. Okay, sorry, I'm kind of going to my own little rant here. Yeah, we're also going to do two virtual engagements. So we have our first 2 engagements for the study are going to, for November, since it's a short timeline that we've had, we're just going to focus on 2 communities, 2 friendship centers at this point in time, which is Prince George. And they have a huge housing and homelessness program. And then Winnipeg, who just restarted their friendship center and are starting to work back into the community in Winnipeg. So we're starting to work with those 2 friendship centers. And then we have Happy Valley Goose Bay, who we're working with as well. And then we're also going to be working with, I think, the Odawa Friendship Center in Ottawa. Yeah, my mind's kind of going there. So we have the 4 friendship centers, and we'll be doing 2 virtual engagements to try getting the voice across the country for those people that weren't able to participate in the in-person engagements. So we created a package for the community. So we tried making this as transparent to our friendship centers as possible. We have community-driven research initiatives across the country. So we have to work within each community's guidelines and ethics. So we worked on a research methodology that was the friendship center's guiding principles. And then we looked at that and we fit into the guiding principles of each friendship center's region. If they had any research that was done previously within housing and homelessness. And one of the big research studies is Happy Valley Goose Bay did a really big and huge research study. And they looked not only at their friendship center, but the migration that came from the First Nation outside of Labrador, St. John's, I think, the Labrador Friendship Center. So they looked at migration. So one of the things already through our methodology is I was at the Healing Our Spirit Worldwide last week, and was able to meet with the AFN policy analyst. And we talked about these gaps in knowledge that we have. So it's already starting creating partnerships, potential partnerships with AFN, looking at their research and us looking at the gaps that we both have in our research through that migration of our community members going back and forth. Yeah, so our methodology was created through looking at the Friendship Center movement. It was really through the experience of urban Indigenous identities. And then we looked at our literature review, which Gael did a great job talking about, and we ensured that we had an intersectional approach, and we really looked at a gender-based approach to all the work that we do now. And it's interesting to take that approach because then we are looking at the intersection of youth and women and gender and sexual diverse people, racism and discrimination, the distinctions-based approaches that come from the government and how they don't work from an urban Indigenous perspective, which totally doesn't work within the teachings of intersectionalities. And then we also looked at the migration, looking at the migrational studies and trying to find a way to look at the gap that's happening between people's homes. I was part of a project prior where a lot of the First Nations people's homes were not the city, their homes were their home community. So how do we make the cities their homes as well? So there's a lot of gaps in the research, and we're just going through presently just doing the engagement sessions. And as Gael put into the timeline, by this time next year, we'll start the plan, and we should have a framework done by, I would say, March 2025, I think is the ultimate goal for us to have a national framework. And I just wanted to go also with the data that Kyle was speaking about. So we started a huge data process at our national office, and it's not just the housing that's putting information in. The languages research and languages programs are submitting data into there. Our health programs and health research is all being submitted into the data. So within the next few years, we're expecting the data that we're collecting now to be able to be used in a very secure, but in a secure process, but also for all friendship centers to really do their own research and look at the valuable information that they were able to provide to us through data. And so in the next few years, we'll have a huge collection of data that we're going to be able to cross-reference with a lot of the research that we're doing right now. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Was there anything else?
No, thank you for that. I think essentially too, one of our main things here at the NAFC is being able to meet folks where they're at within their journey, whether it's within implementation of a housing project, doing their needs assessments and so forth. And so that's why we've also ensured of sharing everything as a drafted version to ensure that we're able to still, again, ensure that we're aligning with their current realities and their current goals. And so we're able to meet that each friendship center with throughout this project where they're at. And then that could also feed into the national action plan. So folks that are just starting can pick this up. And then folks that are in the midst of implementing their projects and looking for something of reference can pick that up. And then someone that's thinking about like the succession of their projects can also pick this up. So this is going to be seen as an evergreen, active resource that can be used by anyone throughout any level within the National Association of Friendship Centers or within the Friendship Center movement. And yeah. And so I just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone for taking the time to listen to us speak. And we look forward to hearing your questions.
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you guys. Great presentation. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand, or I can pick someone from the chat. Okay, let's see here. So I have a question from Viola Thomas. Is your research addressing impacts of violence against Indigenous women and homelessness, besides impacts of addictions and mental health challenges? For and how many elders and women and gender diverse persons continue to have the most impacts on homelessness and child apprehensions? What is your definition of homelessness?
I guess I can start and work backwards. So that's kind of one of our main approaches with this project. We wanted to ensure that we're able to provide a baseline drafted version of what the definition of homelessness is. So engaging with, for example, CMHC and OFHA, and using that as a bit of a guiding light in terms of defining that. But at the end of the day, ultimately, at the center of our engagement with our friendship centers, we want these folks to define it, to ensure that the work is still relevant, and the work that we carry forth is relevant to them. And then in terms of the first question as well, and maybe Jonathan can also contribute more to that too. One great thing is that the research department isn't the only folks that are working on housing and homelessness or the topic of that right now. I believe we have someone within our policy department that houses the MMIWG QS Plus folder. And I think that they're also working on some projects surrounding housing and that topic within their work as well. So we're really treating this as an interdepartmental initiative to kind of feed off wherever gaps may be missing. So although we may have an introductory portion that focuses on, let's say, women and children, we're also leaning on other departments throughout their expertise to also kind of like fill in those gaps. Jonathan?
Yeah, and we do have, through our gender-based approach, we do take the time to clarify and to ensure that those approaches that are facing our Indigenous women and our gender diverse populations and sexual diverse populations are being met within the research. So like the literature review that we just completed, and it's evergreen, so it's always a living document right now. We just had it revisited and we made sure that the intersectional approach was in there. And we did a GBA analysis approach into there. And we also put OCAP principles as the basis for a lot of the research that we're doing right now, alongside of our guiding principles. So through that, we're always ensuring that we're taking that Indigenous worldview that includes all genders and sexualities and identities. But I'm sure we have gaps here and there because we aren't a specific Two-Spirit or gender diverse organization, but I actually was the executive director for Two Spirits in Motion for 2 years, which is the national Two-Spirit organization. And I do know a lot of the work that we were doing there was in partnership with a lot of the national organizations as well. And before I left, we were actually going into creating partnerships with NAFC. So I know there are approaches, and we have a gender diverse staff right now. So it's really good that even when the staff are in separate roles, they just in housing, they are ensuring that they are taking that personal responsibility to put that work into it as well. But yeah, we do have, there's a lot of work, especially our youth have taken that approach where they created a gender-based analysis booklet. And that's being shared across the Friendship Center movement, and that's just coming out in the next month or two. So, and that will influence all the programs that we're doing. And it was created by the youth, for the youth, and for the Friendship Center movement. So we're able to get the voice from the youth on what they want to see through our programs and services, looking at intersectional approaches and a GBA analysis that they created. Hope that answers it all.
Okay, let's see. Don't see any more hands, so I can ask a question. So your research on the encampments, I'm wondering if that is the first of its kind so far, or are there others?
As it goes right now, there was encampment specific on recently. I think it's new within the Indigenous community, but I do know, like, again, my previous experience, I used to work downtown East Side here in Vancouver. Then in the early to mid 2000s, there was a huge community-based research funding projects for people in the downtown East Side. So I do know at that time, before there were encampments, they were still dealing with the tent cities at that time. So I know that there was a lot of research done at that time, but I think from a national scope, we are probably working with the OFHA office. It's probably a first of its kind, especially our partnership with them. And their office is a first of its kind. So I would assume that this research is coming at a time where it's going to be a first, but not the last.
Thank you. So I guess we'll get moving along to our third and final presenter. So up next, we have Marie McGregor-Petawanakwa, representing the National Indigenous Housing Network. So Marie is an Anishinaabe from Wikwemikong on unceded territory on Manitoulin Island, Ontario. Marie serves as a co-chair for both the National Indigenous Housing Network and the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. Marie brings the lived experience of homelessness to her work with Indigenous peoples who are facing precarious and inadequate housing situations, including Indigenous women who experience violence and homelessness. In June 2022, the National Indigenous Housing Network launched a human rights claim addressed to the Government of Canada, citing abrogation of the right to housing. A response from the federal government is still pending. The National Indigenous Housing Network is currently working on a project titled Even the Bear Has a Home, which aims to gather first-person stories, insights, and experiences of homelessness and precarity through a range of evidence-gathering methodologies such as focus groups, audio and video documentation, summits, and circle sharing. The objective of this project is to create a body of lived expert evidence that expands upon and provides evidence to support the 2 human rights claims submitted to the Federal Housing Advocate by the Native Women's National Association and Homelessness Network and the National Indigenous Housing Network. So please welcome Marie McGregor-Pitawanakwat.
Ani bonjour wachier, Mani McGregor Pitwanput Dijnakas, Doga Kwe Dao, Doganing Donjaba, Manadom Singh. As Tara mentioned, my name is Marie McGregor Pitawanakwat. I live in Doganing in Wequampong. Doganing is the Anishinaabe word for South Bay. I'm a Doga Kwe, a South Bay woman, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about the work of the National Indigenous Housing Network and also some of the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, for whom I serve as co-chair. I'll go now to my PowerPoint. The National Indigenous Housing Network was formerly known as the National Indigenous Feminist Housing Network, which met before it came in virtual meetings and with groups across the country to talk about the meaning of home. What does home mean to you? What did it mean in pre-colonial times? What does it mean now? What is the situation of your home as it is? And what is it that you are looking for? Now, if I can go to the next slide, please. I think I'll need help here. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next part. The National Indigenous Housing Network arose out of the National Indigenous Feminist Housing Network when it was realized that we aren't just working with women, we're working with Indigenous girls and women, gender diverse people, and two-spirited. And so what happened as a result of those discussions is we got together with the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, and in which we talked about the possibility of a human rights claim. At first, we talked about a joint claim, and then we realized that the Indigenous claim has to be a separate one for some very important reasons. And those reasons were that Indigenous peoples are living on our own homelands, and very many of us are homeless on our own homelands. If you think about it, we have been here since 50,000 years BP, before present. And so we are on our ancestral territories, and yet very many of us are homeless and living in precarious housing. And so we talked about submitting a separate claim, which we did in June of 2022. And in that claim, there were 4 violations. One arose out of what was described in the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report, where 300 times over, the lack of access to safe and secure housing was mentioned as contributing factors to Indigenous women going missing or murdered. And also 2 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Report, where the intergenerational trauma and the residual trauma arising from the 60s scoop and from the Indian residential school system led to a series of situations where Indigenous peoples are precariously housed or live in overcrowded housing or live in completely inadequate housing. And so that claim was launched in June of 2022 in Ottawa. And the other violations that were cited were interjurisdictional neglect, in that often there was conflict or tension between federal, provincial, or municipal and territorial governments about who were the actors who were there to assist and serve Indigenous peoples to acquire housing. That is one of them. And then the other having to do with the siloization and the lack of secure land tenure. Because as soon as you start talking about housing, you're talking about secure land tenure. And the secure land tenure is an item that's required in order to have secure housing for Indigenous peoples. The other part of it having to do with the recommendations. Before I get to that, though, I'd like to talk about situations that led up to there being a human rights claim. There's a story out there about an Indigenous woman, and this was described by Mavis Erickson in 2001. And the story is that an Aboriginal woman committed suicide after the authorities apprehended her children. So this is about a woman and her 5 children who was trying to live on her own reserve and who was forced to leave there because of a chronic housing shortage. And so what happened was that she went off to an urban area to look for affordable housing off reserve. She did find shelter, but it was in a rundown boarding house where she tried to live with her 5 children. She asked for help in finding appropriate housing, and instead, the authorities apprehended her children. After trying to get them back and succumbing to despair, she took her own life. So this is a real-life example of what happens when there is homelessness, inadequate housing, precarious housing, and unsafe housing. So let's go back to this idea of an Indian reserve. So 0.36% of our land in Canada is Indian reserve land. So in other words, roughly 1/3 of 1%. So flip that over and you've got 99.64% of land in Canada that is not Indian reserve land. So what does that mean? It means that Indian reserves are not owned by Indian people, because if an Indian and an Indian reserve has a certificate of possession or a CP, all that is quasi-ownership. And full legal title to Indian reserve land is held by the Crown. So in effect, Indian people do not own Indian land on Indian reserves. And what you have here is an image of a house on the res. I was given home by my late parents. They were exercising their rightful authority in giving land as they had done in that community for generations, from one generation to another. And so they gave home to me. I spent about $25,000 on the foundation and was in the process of renovating the rest. And I was evicted from there by a former sibling who was exercising the existence of a certificate of possession, never mind the ancestral legal authority that was held by the parents, and the exercise of Indigenous allodial land title. Indigenous allodial land title is what we continue to hold despite the treaties, despite the expropriations, despite the thefts, and despite the removal of our people from land that were used to make the railways. The reason that there is a Royal Canadian Mounted Police now is that they arose out of a force called the Northwest Mounted Police, who were created in order to remove Indigenous peoples from their homelands so that the railroads could be built. The reason there is a Hudson Bay Company is that somebody named Prince Rupert was traveling around in the Northern Territories near what is now Hudson Bay, between there and what is now the foothills of the Rockies. He decided that he liked that land. He went home to ask his cousin, the king, for it. The cousin wrote him a piece of paper and said, "Here, Prince Rupert, you can have all of that land." And not once did anyone stop to consider that those lands were owned by Indigenous peoples, or that they could be purchased from them, or that they should be asked before taking those lands. And so you have these outstanding expropriations and thefts that have never been completely resolved. And also, if the terms of the treaties are not enforced, they become null and void. If they become null and void, then that 99% of land still is held in ownership by Indigenous peoples. So I come now to the National Indigenous Housing Network's human rights claim. I mentioned earlier the lack of action on the calls to justice from the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report, and the lack of action on the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation report. Violation 2 speaks to the failure to provide safe, adequate, and culturally appropriate housing on our own terms. Violation 3, as stated previously, talks about multiple systems failure and institutional betrayal. Violation 4 talks about security of tenure. Secure Indigenous land tenure is what is required. Those words are chosen specifically and particularly because they are important when you start talking about Indigenous people's right to housing. If we're going to place housing, it has to be placed on secure Indigenous land tenure. The recommendations, this comes from a report written in 2004 by the Native Women's Association. The author is Sharon Chisholm. One of the recommendations is for participatory decision-making processes involving those with low incomes from diverse backgrounds, who need to be included at every level of housing policy and programming, along with access to training and supports. For example, child care allowance. I come now to the recommendations in the human rights claim, and there are 12. The first one is that the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate appoint a panel of Indigenous knowledge keepers, elders, and advocates. The second is that these folks advocate for the development of an oversight body to include Indigenous peoples. The third is to engage with the National Action Plan for Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls to establish an Indigenous Human Rights Tribunal. The fourth is to support and co-develop an evidence-building process. The fifth is, it is recommended to the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate to promote our right to self-determination. Number 6 speaks to the recommendation to OFHA to create measurable targets for home design, construction, and access to building materials. Number 7 is a recommendation to OFHA to facilitate training programs for creating our own housing. This is not such a far-fetched idea. I've seen photos of Indigenous women building their own homes and using travel, using horses, and carrying all of the materials for the poles and teepees. And for Anishinaabe women in the northeastern woodlands, setting up frameworks for wigwams using both birch bark and elm bark. So it was the woman's responsibility to care for the home, and in many instances also to build the home. And that capacity has been removed from us through Canada's continuing attempts to colonize. Recommendation number 8 is for an Indigenous-led inquiry into the effects and outcomes of historical and ongoing housing funding programs. Number 9 speaks to exploring how affordability and priority setting in criteria in Indigenous housing programs fail. Number 10 is to look at definitions of homelessness. How do these reflect Indigenous reality? If I can refer to one definition of homelessness, it includes people who are in nursing homes, hospitals, who are incarcerated, who are in long-term care homes. And it also speaks to those who are 2 or 3 mortgage payments away from not being able to make your house payments. You're now at risk of homelessness. There's also Jesse Thistle's definition of homelessness, which looks at, yes, the practical dimensions of not having shelter over your head, but also the homelessness that's engendered spiritually and culturally. Spiritual homelessness is what happens when you are separated from your trees, your animals, your waters, your sky, your cosmos. Those beings under earth, those that are in the sky and all around you, your connection to your family, your connection to your clan, your connection to your kin, your connection to your community, and your connection to your nation. If those are missing, then you are also homeless. I would also like to speak to the matter of encampments. Encampments is such a strange word because it talks about, when I see the word, I see an image of a family jumping into an SUV, having thrown the tent and camping equipment in the back, going off to a park to camp for 2 or 3 days, and then they have a home to drive back to at the end of their weekend. An encampment for homeless people is not an encampment. It's an exercise in agency. It's an exercise in people doing the very best they can to help themselves, to provide shelter for themselves. And when others bring their tents and gather around together, 5 or 6 of them, 7, 8, 9, 10, and more, now you're having tent villages and tent communities. Communities, because then someone from that gathering will come along and say, oh, I know where you can have a shower. Or, oh, I know where you can get the best soup in town. Or, oh, I know where you can do laundry. And so you have people offering to help each other out. To me, that's a community. So they are tent communities. And again, we need to look at the definition of homelessness so that it reflects Indigenous reality. The last 2 recommendations that are contained in our human rights claim. Number 11 is to look at how funding programs for Indigenous peoples could eliminate Indigenous children's homelessness. Oftentimes we overlook the children, and again, it was Indigenous women who were responsible for the children and the home, and also to construct those homes in many instances. And so if the children are homeless, then this is something that needs to be examined much more carefully. And also children have their own bills of rights. And lastly, number 12, the transparent and publicly accessible ways to see that gender equality is being achieved through Indigenous specific funding provision. So those are the 12 recommendations contained in the National Indigenous Housing Network's human rights claim. Where we are now is to schedule engagement sessions with communities, looking to the north, the south, the east, and the west, and to ask for storytelling and evidence gathering so that we can add these to our human rights claim. And we are requesting the participation of communities, and we will very respectfully gather the stories that need to be told to add to the claim. And on that note, I say thank you very much for allowing me to share our story, Chimiwech. And now the floor is open for questions. Now.
All right. Chimiwech Marie, thank you for sharing. I believe we have a question, live question from Sarah Gibson. You have the floor.
So sorry, that was an accidental hand, but thank you for the presentation.
Okay. We have a comment, I think, here from Claudette Miigwech Marie McGregor Pitawanakwat for speaking about the colonial historic truths impacting First Nations. These truths and realities explain government policies and actions. Spoken words of truth. We also had another question if any of the presenters are comfortable sharing their PowerPoint slides. We'd have a request from a viewer, if that's okay. Yep. Let's see.
I do have a question for or more of a comment, but I would really like to meet with you on the OFHA recommendations and see how we can work together on bringing forward your voice and the voice of this report to the OFHA. That's one of the main points that we wanted to start this relationship with them, was to ensure that we are bringing forward some of these recommendations. Like I know Ontario Friendship Centers have brought forward some recommendations as well. So it'd be myself and Guy already chatting, and we would really like to meet with you and go forward with our engagement session with you, and maybe you can engage with us through your sessions, but maybe we could do a co-engagement together and really go forward with a lot of the things you brought forward as well. So thank you. I learned a lot from your presentation.
Thank you. And I just have a comment too. Number 8, your recommendations, number 8, kind of caught my attention. That one talked about and calling for an inquiry for the effects and outcomes of historical and ongoing housing funding programs. You know, there's no data on that, and I'm sure that if this did come about, we would find evidence of loss of life and family trauma.
Yeah, I think there was a Native Women's Association of Canada report maybe 20 years ago that talked about some of the realities of what's happened with Indigenous women. And I think the story gathering and collection of testimonies will add to the raw data, the qualitative data that can be very useful in helping to paint a picture of what really exists, and also to collect the stories with the storyteller's permission, of course. And those are important for a number of reasons. One is for the person who carries the story to release it, to let it out into the world, to also share it so that others who have had similar experiences can say, oh, I have had similar experiences, let's talk together. And also what's important is to add it to the public record, so that if, decades from now, we're still facing the same issues, that we can look back and say, oh, weren't there evidence gatherings? Weren't there plans and processes and projects that discuss these things? Why don't we look back in that 40 years before, and see what happened? And the reason I say that is that in the 70s, there were similar experiences among Indigenous people in urban centers who were experiencing lack of access to housing. And there were programs in place to provide that urban housing. And so that already happened. And so here we are facing it again, except that now it's more severe and more widespread and more well known. So yeah, we do need to make sure that we have the stories and that it becomes part of the public record.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so I guess we're at the end of our webinar, and I just want to say a couple closing remarks. So Chimigwich, to our presenters, and to Claudette, we thank you for sharing your time and your wisdom with us today. It's much appreciated. And I'd like to thank my colleagues for their assistance helping me to organize. So thank you to Kim, Ray, and Chloe, and also our colleagues over at CMHC, Kyla and Lauren. I couldn't have done this without you guys. And so I hope everybody enjoyed the webinar, and hope to see you at some of our upcoming events. So take care. Thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you. Thank you, Tara. Good job. And thank you, Marie. Excellent. Oh, beautiful words spoken. Thank you for the truths you share with us, and to all the presenters. Beautiful work. Continue the good work. And Yangomas in the Wichkiwe Dugnigawa, men. Until we see each other again, take good care. Love you guys.